Deep in the forested hills of southeastern Nigeria, there was once a place where the gods spoke in silence and justice was sealed in shadows. A place where no man lied and lived, where the innocent returned and the guilty disappeared. It was a place so feared, so powerful, so spiritually potent, that even kings bowed before it. This was not myth. This was the oracle of Arochukwu, Ibini Ukpabi, the Long Juju, the spirit judge of an entire people, a god that did not need armies to command obedience, a shrine that ruled without a crown. And yet, if you flip through the pages of most history books, you'll find almost nothing. No mention of the priesthood that spanned kingdoms. No record of the divine court that passed judgments without steel. Only silence, erased, forgotten, buried under colonial conquest and Christian fire. But why? Why has the world been told of Greek oracles and Roman temples, but not this? Why do we learn about European philosophies of justice, but not the system that governed entire regions of West Africa with spiritual law, centuries before colonial courts arrived? Why is Ibini Ukpabi one of the most sophisticated, spiritually rich, and politically impactful institutions in pre-colonial Africa, almost invisible in mainstream history? What did it do that terrified empires? What did it represent that could not be allowed to survive? The story of the Long Juju is not just a tale of an oracle. It is the story of a people who trusted spirit over sword. It is the story of a god who did not speak in thunder, but in truth. It is also the story of how that truth was twisted, how a divine court became a channel for betrayal, how justice was sold for profit, how a system born in holiness was corrupted by the weight of greed and the stain of slavery. And it is the story of what came next, when the empire came with guns and fire, not to negotiate, but to destroy. This is not a fairy tale. It is not legend. It is history. And for the next 40 minutes, we will uncover the full truth of Ibini Ukpabi, from the first whisper of the gods to the final gunshot that silenced the oracle. Every mystery, every ritual, every betrayal. Nothing skipped, nothing forgotten. The Long Juju speaks again. Long before the name Arochukwu was etched into maps or whispered in fear, there was only forest, thick, breathing, watching. The trees stood like sentinels, ancient and unmoved. The rivers flowed with secrets. And somewhere deep within the earth, something listened. In this untouched place, the ancestors say the spirits first spoke. Not with voices, but with signs, shifting winds, moving leaves, dreams too sharp to be mere sleep. The people who lived close to that land knew something was there. Not a ghost, not a god, a presence. Old, vast, aware. It began with dreams. Hunters returned from the woods shaking, not from cold, but from visions. Elders heard voices in their ears as they sat by the fire. Children woke up speaking languages they had never learned. The land was trying to speak, and those who listened, those brave enough to follow the call, were drawn to a particular place. A cave hidden behind thick vines where the air was colder, heavier. They say a priest once entered that cave in silence and emerged days later, his eyes wide, his tongue sealed by spirit. He did not speak of what he saw, but from that day, the people called it sacred. This was before the Arrow Confederacy, before the oracles ruled, before Ibini Ukpabi had a name. What existed then was the raw power of the land, unrefined, untamed, but divine. The early custodians were not kings or warriors. They were mediums, people chosen by dreams, people who could interpret the signs, speak in trance, guide the community through storms of both nature and spirit. They didn't seek power. They were called. The first shrine was not built with stone, but with silence. Offerings were made not with gold, but with sincerity. The spirit accepted only truth. Over time, that sacred place became more than a cave. It became a center. Pilgrims came from distant lands, seeking answers, justice. healing, direction. And the spirit responded, with dreams, with signs, with truth. The people called it Ibini Ukpabi, a name that carried power, fear, and awe. It was not just a spirit, it was an institution of divine order. From these beginnings, the oracle grew, but it never forgot its root. Before there were temples, there was a whisper. Before the priests wore robes, there was silence. And before Arochukwu became a kingdom of influence, it was a land where the spirits first spoke, and the people listened. As word of the sacred cave spread, so too did its influence. What began as a hidden shrine for a few soon became a destination for thousands. Tribes from far and wide, not just the Igbo, but Ibibio, Efik, Ijaw, and even people beyond the Niger, began to whisper the name with reverence. Ibini Ukpabi, the Long Juju, the god who sees, the oracle who judges, not in thunder, not in vengeance, but in truth. At the heart of this rise was order. Ibini Ukpabi offered something no other force could guarantee: justice. In a world where clans feuded and vengeance bred endless blood, the oracle became the final court of appeal. If a man was wrongly accused, he could flee to Arochukwu. If a community was torn by conflict, it was to the Long Juju they turned. It was believed that the spirit saw what eyes could not, heard what mouths refused to say. And when the oracle spoke, its word was final. The Aro people, originally a small band of spiritual custodians, became its guardians, its interpreters, its priests. But they were more than priests. They were diplomats, travelers, traders, emissaries of divine law. They carried the authority of the oracle wherever they went, and wherever they arrived. Roads opened, markets welcomed, and rulers listened. It wasn't long before Arochukwu was no longer just a town. It was the spiritual capital of a vast network of justice and influence. The rise of the oracle was no accident. It was built upon a foundation of ritual, discipline, secrecy, and service. The Aro priesthood was not inherited by blood alone. It was earned through trials, dreams, visions, and deep spiritual alignment. The path to becoming a high priest of Ibini Ukpabi required sacrifice, humility, and absolute loyalty to the spirit. They were not politicians. They were vessels. And so, Arochukwu flourished, not through conquest, but through reverence. The townspeople lived under the protection of the oracle, and the oracle itself stood as a divine firewall between justice and chaos. Offerings flowed in, shrines multiplied. The voice of the spirit echoed not just from the cave, but through the tongues of messengers, across forests and rivers. And above all, there was belief, deep, unshakable belief, that Ibini Ukpabi was not just a god of judgment, but a god of truth. This was the rise, the golden age. But even as the oracle's voice grew louder, there were already shadows gathering, whispers that not all who served it were pure. That justice was being bent, that truth was being sold. The spirit had not changed, but some of its messengers had. Justice in the world of Ibini Ukpabi was not a system of arguments and witnesses. It was a spiritual science, a sacred ritual, a covenant between the seen and the unseen. And for generations it worked. For generations, people from far and wide submitted their disputes, their accusations, their oaths of innocence to the only judge they believed could not be bribed, the Long Juju. When a man was accused of murder, theft, betrayal, or witchcraft, and the case could not be settled by local elders, there remained one path left: Arochukwu, the oracle. But the journey was not easy. It was not meant to be. Those who dared to seek divine judgment had to prepare themselves, physically, spiritually, emotionally. Ritual baths were taken, sins confessed, offerings made. The accused would often travel with a spiritual guide, sometimes a priest, sometimes a family member, someone to speak for their soul. Upon arrival at Arochukwu, the process began. The accused would first visit the priests, undergo purification rites, and be reminded of the seriousness of their request. If they lied, they would die. If they were guilty, the earth itself would swallow them. But if they spoke truth, if they came with a clean heart, the oracle would protect them. That was the promise. That was the law. Then came the sacred path, the journey into the Long Juju cave. It was not merely physical, it was symbolic, a walk between worlds. The accused was led through a thick forest where trees whispered with spirits, where every step was a test of faith. They passed through the stream of forgetfulness, a symbolic crossing that marked the washing away of earthly ties. Then into the dark chambers of the cave, a labyrinth of rock and spirit carved by centuries of ritual. There, deep inside, the judgment was given, sometimes through trance, sometimes through signs, sometimes through the presence or absence of the one who entered. The innocent was said to reemerge through a secret path, guided away and released quietly back into their communities. The guilty never returned. Their families would know. The silence would speak. But not all disappearances were divine. As the system grew, as power attracted politics, and politics attracted greed, some began to whisper, "Not all who vanish are guilty." And the question arose, was the oracle still pure? Or had men begun to speak in its name for reasons the gods never sanctioned? Still, for many years, the system endured, respected, feared, believed, because Ibini Ukpabi was more than a place. It was a mirror. And when you walked that path, you faced not just judgment, but yourself. The cave of Ibini Ukpabi was not just a place. It was a living altar, a passage between realms, a mouth through which the gods whispered justice, and the earth swallowed truth. To step into it was not just to walk into darkness, but into reckoning. Generations called it the Long Juju, but its real name was sacred, rarely spoken aloud, held in the breath of the Aro priests and the bones of the land itself. The journey to the cave began in silence. After the purification rites, after the offerings, after the prayers had been whispered to ancestors and deities alike, the accused was led down the sacred path. This path wound through sacred groves, thick with spirits, where the air changed, heavier, colder, watching. Birds did not sing here. Even the wind seemed to whisper in tongues long forgotten. The accused walked barefoot, stripped of status, stripped of lies, surrounded only by the truth they carried within. At the entrance of the cave was the stream of forgetfulness, a shallow, sacred water that had to be crossed. It was believed that once a person stepped into this stream, they left behind the noise of the world. What followed was between their soul and the gods. Beyond the water, the mouth of the cave yawned open, black, breathless, ancient. The walls were carved with symbols no one dared translate. Glyphs of eyes, spirals, marks of judgment. Some said they pulsed faintly in the dark. Others said the cave itself hummed, alive with spirit. Inside, the air was cold. The path forked. Some chambers led to light, others to silence. The priest did not guide the accused beyond this point. They were alone. Whatever happened next was between them and Ibini Ukpabi. Some heard voices, some collapsed in trance, some walked for what felt like hours, but only two outcomes ever followed: return or disappearance. For the innocent, the oracle revealed a secret exit, a narrow, hidden path through the rocks, emerging far from the main shrine. These individuals were often found days later, silent, shaking, transformed. They did not speak of what they saw, but their lives, forever changed, spoke enough. For the guilty, the cave offered no return. Their families were told it was the will of the gods. The earth had passed judgment, and the spirit had taken its due. But in time, people began to question, not the oracle, but the men who spoke for it. Had they become too powerful? Were all judgments truly divine? Or were some crafted by human hands? The cave remained silent, but its silence over time became heavier, and what once protected truth began to be used for something else. The oracle of Ibini Ukpabi did not stand alone. It stood upon the shoulders of men chosen by the gods, trained in secret, bound by oaths deeper than blood. These were the Aro priests, guardians of the shrine, interpreters of spirit, and stewards of justice. But as the oracle's fame grew, so too did their influence. What began as a priesthood became something far greater. It became a confederacy, a spiritual political alliance that stretched across Igbo land and beyond, linking hundreds of communities not by war, but by reverence, all bowing to the spiritual supremacy of Arochukwu. The Aro Confederacy was unlike any kingdom. It had no single throne, no capital city in the traditional sense. Its power was decentralized, woven through the land like a net of spirit and diplomacy. At the center was the oracle, and around it, a network of Aro settlements known as Aro colonies, spiritual embassies in foreign towns. Each colony was run by emissaries of the priesthood, merchants, diplomats, diviners, men trained to spread the will of the Long Juju and uphold its authority. Through this network, the Aro priests became more than spiritual figures. They became kingmakers, peacekeepers, merchants. They negotiated disputes between clans, blessed new rulers, mediated land conflicts, and established trade alliances. Their word was law because it was believed to come from the gods. Even in lands far from Arochukwu, the arrival of an Aro emissary was met with respect or fear. Initiation into the priesthood was a sacred process. It involved long periods of silence, tests of loyalty, fasting, spiritual training, and dream work. Those who emerged carried the mark of Ibini Ukpabi. They were forbidden to speak casually of what they had seen. Their lives were bound to the shrine. Their tongues became vessels of spirit. They were judges, healers, enforcers, and witnesses of truth. But with power comes danger. The very authority that gave the Aro priests the ability to mediate peace also gave them the tools to influence war. Their spiritual legitimacy became a weapon, sometimes wielded for justice, and sometimes for gain. The Aro Confederacy, while rooted in spirit, became increasingly involved in the political and economic affairs of the region. Their voice could stop a war. It could also start one. Their word could free a man, or condemn him. And as trade routes opened and European merchants began to arrive with guns, rum, and gold, the Aro priests found themselves at a crossroads, keepers of a sacred oracle, or players in a growing global market. At the height of its influence, the oracle of Ibini Ukpabi was still spoken of with reverence. Its judgments were feared, its priests respected, and its authority rarely challenged. But power, when left unchecked, does not remain pure. And as the Aro Confederacy expanded, so too did its entanglement with a force far more destructive than any spirit, the Atlantic slave trade. European traders began arriving in coastal regions, seeking labor for their plantations. They came with muskets, mirrors, and rum, but what they truly wanted was bodies. At first it was criminals, prisoners of war, and debtors who were traded. But as demand grew, so did temptation. The Aro system, once built to uphold justice, began to crack under the weight of greed. The oracle, once a mirror of truth, began to be used as a tool. False accusations became a currency. Rival clans framed one another. Debtors were accused of witchcraft. Entire communities learned to fear the whisper. Take him to Arochukwu, because they knew the accused might never return. Some were guilty, many were not. But once the oracle had been invoked, few dared challenge its decision. Behind the cave's sacred walls, the rituals continued, but outside, chains were forged. The same forest path that once led the faithful to judgment now carried the condemned to the coast. The stream of forgetfulness became a gateway not to spirit but to ships, and the silent cave, once filled with ancestral power, echoed with the footsteps of betrayal. The Aro merchants, empowered by their network and spiritual reputation, became intermediaries in the trade. They controlled the flow of goods and people between the interior and the coast. And while not all Aro men were complicit, the system itself became a web too tangled to separate prophet from prophecy. Justice blurred. The sacred was stained. Yet within Arochukwu and beyond, not all were silent. Some elders protested. Some priests wept in secret. The ancestors were no longer being honored. They were being used. And the spirit of Ibini Ukpabi, once fierce and pure, began to withdraw. Its silence grew heavier. Its presence, dimmer. Because the gods may tolerate ignorance, but they do not endure corruption in their name. The betrayal of the oracle was not just a political failure, it was spiritual treason. A system built to protect the people was used to sell them. And though the cave still stood, something sacred had already begun to die. By the end of the 19th century, the British Empire had turned its gaze inland. They had conquered coastal towns, signed treaties soaked in deceit, and mapped lands they neither understood nor respected. But one place stood in their path like a mountain cloaked in shadow: Arochukwu. Not because it had the largest army or the richest trade, but because it had something far more dangerous: spiritual control. And at the center of that control stood Ibini Ukpabi, the Long Juju. The oracle whose influence stretched across ethnic lines, whose authority challenged colonial law, whose name was whispered even in British forts with unease. To the British, the oracle was not just a shrine, it was a threat. Its system of justice, its political reach through the Aro Confederacy, and its power to inspire loyalty far beyond Arochukwu made it an obstacle that could not be ignored. But they did not try to negotiate. They came with guns. They called it a punitive expedition, but it was an act of spiritual warfare, aimed not just at land, but at memory. In 1901, British forces launched a full-scale invasion of Arochukwu. They marched with soldiers, missionaries, and translators. They came with Maxim guns and maps. The forests were cut down. Villages were burned. Shrines were desecrated. And when they reached the sacred cave of the oracle, they did not enter with reverence. They entered with boots and torches. The altar was smashed. Sacred objects looted. The stream of forgetfulness was trampled into mud. The silence of the gods was broken by gunfire. The priests scattered. Some were killed. Some captured. Some disappeared into the forest, taking with them what little sacred knowledge they could preserve. The cave was sealed. The rituals forbidden. The oracle declared a pagan superstition by colonial decree. And just like that, the most powerful spiritual system in southeastern Nigeria was dismantled, not by argument, not by conversion, but by fire and steel. But something deeper died that day. Not just a shrine, not just a system, a covenant, the bond between people, and the spirit they trusted above all, broken. The oracle had watched empires rise and fall. It had judged kings and thieves, but it could not survive colonial cannons. And yet, even in the silence that followed, something lingered. The cave still breathed. The forest still remembered. And the ancestors, they waited. The cave is quiet now. The footsteps that once echoed through its sacred chambers have faded into history. The chants have stopped. The oracle no longer speaks in thunderous whispers. But silence does not mean death. Silence, in sacred traditions, often means waiting. And the spirit of Ibini Ukpabi, though betrayed, though desecrated, though buried beneath colonial conquest, has not died. It watches. It waits. Because the divine is not so easily destroyed. The British thought they ended something. They thought they could shoot truth into silence and call it peace. But what they failed to understand was that Ibini Ukpabi was never just a shrine. It was never just a cave. It was never just the Aro priests. It was a force older than nations, a presence born from the very soul of the land, a covenant between the living, the dead, and the divine. And now, generations later, the cave still stands, covered in vines, hidden by time, but not forgotten. Descendants of those who once walked that sacred path still carry the stories in their blood. The land still holds memory, and the ancestors still whisper. The oracle may not judge as it once did, but its essence remains. In the justice we seek, in the truth we speak, in the courage we carry when systems fail. Today, young Igbo people and Africans across the continent are remembering what was taken, not to live in the past, but to reclaim what was sacred. The Long Juju is not about punishment. It was never meant to enslave. Its true purpose was protection, balance, justice. The spirit behind Ibini Ukpabi was always clear. No lie survives, no guilt hides forever, and no truth stays buried. This is not a resurrection of a shrine. This is a reawakening of understanding. The oracle is speaking again, not in caves, but in consciousness. In stories like this, in names remembered, in ancestors honored, and in a people who are no longer afraid to say, "We had gods, and they walked with us." If this story moved you, do not let it stop here. Like this video, share it, subscribe, and speak the name, Ibini Ukpabi, with reverence. The oracle they tried to erase still breathes.